New York City in the 19th century was a place of remarkable contrasts. Grand mansions stood not far from crumbling slums. Horse-drawn carriages rolled past barefoot street urchins. Merchant wealth expanded alongside desperate poverty. It was the century where New York became not just a city, but the city, the beating heart of American ambition. But in those dark alleys, far from the sparkling avenues of the wealthy, something else was growing: gangs. Fierce, local, street-born groups that ruled neighborhoods by violence, loyalty, and sheer force of desperation. These were more than thugs. They were folk legends of the underworld. They shaped politics, terrified citizens, and turned neighborhoods like the infamous Five Points into battlefields. From Irish immigrant boys organizing in gin houses to clashes that required the National Guard to suppress, the gangs of 19th century New York became part of the city's DNA. Tonight, let's step back into those smoke-filled streets, glimpse the faces of notorious brawlers like Hellcat Maggie and Bill the Butcher, and trace the evolution of New York gangs from ragtag toughs to the predecessors of organized crime. In the early 1820s, Five Points emerged as New York's most notorious slum. Once a pond filled in with shoddy construction, it had collapsed into overcrowded tenements, muddy alleys, and chaotic saloons. It became home largely to poor Irish immigrants and free Black Americans, people chased by famine, poverty, or discrimination into one of the harshest neighborhoods in the world. Here, in a grocery store run by a woman named Rosanna Pierce, lurked the beginnings of the 40 Thieves. Pierce sold vegetables up front, but in the back, she poured gin strong enough to numb most sorrows. That back room became the meeting ground of New York's first formally organized gang. Mostly young Irish immigrants, the 40 Thieves began as pickpockets, hustlers, and petty criminals. By the mid-1820s, they'd organized themselves into an early underworld fraternity, with Edward Coleman, an Irish tough, as their leader. Legend says Coleman required members to deliver regular tributes of stolen goods or risk expulsion. The 40 Thieves didn't stop there. They recruited boys into a subgroup known as the Little 40 Thieves, training children as pickpockets and lookouts. Imagine Dickens' Oliver Twist, but in the crowded, dangerous stew of Manhattan's Five Points. The gang terrified locals so badly that even newspapers in faraway Vermont warned of the 5 Points. Outrageous crimes, robberies, and beatings became headline stories. In a grim twist, Coleman himself murdered his wife during a drunken rage in 1838, becoming the first man hanged at the notorious Tombs prison. His execution only deepened 5 Points' reputation as a hive of crime. By the 1840s, the landscape grew fiercer. Irish immigrants fleeing famine poured into New York, fueling both gang growth and fierce hostilities. Neighborhoods carved lines of tribal identity. And soon, rival banners rose, most famously the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys. The Dead Rabbits, Irish toughs of 5 Points, got their name, depending on which tale you believe, either from a dead rabbit carcass hurled into one of their meeting halls, or from Irish slang for rowdy youths. They allegedly carried an actual rabbit impaled on a stick into fights, both grotesque symbol and war banner. Their enemies, the Bowery Boys, were native-born Americans often linked to nativist politics. Volunteer firemen by day, gang fighters by night. They strutted in distinctive uniforms, red flannel shirts, stovepipe hats, boots tucked into trousers. To many, they embodied native pride and fierce hostility towards Irish immigrants. Politics bled into violence. The Bowery Boys supported anti-immigrant parties, while the Irish gangs backed Tammany Hall Democrats who courted immigrant voters. Gang battles regularly broke out, sometimes as political intimidation, sometimes just for blood. Their most infamous clash came in July 1857, erupting into a 48-hour melee known as the Dead Rabbits Riot. Thousands fought with clubs, paving stones, knives, and pistols. Police forces, already divided by politics, were overwhelmed. Rooftops rained bricks onto officers below, barricades went up, and the streets ran with blood. Only when the National Guard marched in with bayonets fixed did the riots dissolve. Dozens died, scores were maimed, and New York realized its gangs had become urban armies. The gangs weren't only street brawlers. They became entangled with politics, policing, and even public image. Tammany Hall relied on Irish gangs to intimidate rivals at polling stations, ensuring immigrant votes went their way. In return, political allies and bought-off police captains gave gangs leeway to operate. Gang leaders doubled as political organizers, and election days often became bloodied parades of intimidation. And gangs craved a twisted honor. After the Dead Rabbits riot, the gang paid to publish a letter in the New York Times claiming they weren't thieves at all, merely fighters defending their honor. Even criminals wanted decent branding, it seems. Meanwhile, individuals stood out with frightening theatrics. Women like Hellcat Maggie, who filed her teeth into points and wore brass claws in barroom brawls. Or Dandy John Dolan, notorious for boots rigged with hidden blades. Some gangs even kept price lists for services. $2 to punch a nose, $15 to chew off an ear, $100 to do the big job. Violence wasn't random, it was marketed. After the Civil War, New York's gangs didn't vanish, they evolved. The Wyos of the 1870s-80s rose to dominate Lower Manhattan. Their trademark whistle, Wyo Wyo, gave them a name and became street slang for danger. The Wyos were more structured, a bridge between chaotic street gangs and organized crime. They ran dance halls and saloons, shook down shopkeepers, collected protection money, and rented their muscle to crooked politicians. At night, they robbed, brawled, and killed. Individual members grew infamous for shocking brutality. John Dolan with his eye-gouging tool. Piker Ryan supposedly carrying a menu for prices for beatings and murders. By the 1880s, the Wyos were so feared that entire districts were virtually off-limits to regular citizens. Their downfall came in 1884 when Danny Driscoll was executed for murdering a woman. Public disgust allowed police to finally crush the Wyos, scattering their remnants. Of course, new gangs soon filled the void. Life in Five Points and Hell's Kitchen slums gave gangs both purpose and identity. Young men, often teenagers, grew up in overcrowded, filthy tenements. Work was scarce. Discrimination for Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants meant opportunities were limited. Gang life offered power, camaraderie, and income, even if it was violent, short-lived, and brutal. Headquarters were usually saloons doubling as gang halls. There, leaders gave orders, loot was divided, and fights were planned. Culture mattered. Gangs dressed stylishly or carried trademark weapons. Nicknames like Smoke Morrissey or Bill the Butcher gave them legendary presence. To many slum dwellers, gangs even looked like neighborhood defenders. They fought against rival ethnic groups or against outsiders. And while they terrified as often as they protected, they represented a dark form of belonging in a city that gave them none. By the 1890s, gangs like Paul Kelly's Five Points Gang and Monk Eastman's Jewish-dominated crew transformed New York's underworld into something new. Large, army-sized criminal organizations. Kelly recruited more than 1,500 members, mixing Irish and Italian youths, focusing not just on brawling, but on maintaining vice rings, brothels, and gambling dens. His rival, Monk Eastman, built an equally huge force of Jewish gangsters.
When their turf conflicts exploded, New York saw shootouts of a scale never witnessed before. Gunfights under the elevated railway. Whole avenues turned into battlegrounds. This was the dawn of modern, organized crime. In their ranks, young toughs like Al Capone and Luciano first cut their teeth before carrying gangland traditions into the 20th century. The story of New York's 19th century gangs is one of poverty turned into power, of chaos shaping order, of city streets soaked in both fear and folklore. They began as slum kids stealing loaves of bread and ended as organized criminals whose descendants shaped America's underworld. These gangs forced New York to modernize its police force and grapple with the realities of immigration, class tension, and corruption.